So I'm ready to begin.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Brooke from the Breathing Temple, and this is my wonderful friend, Anna, and a trustworthy shaman that I've been seeing for quite a long time. She has decided to join us today to give us some information about ancestral trauma. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. Please go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I have just been studying shamanic practices since now 1989. I was inspired after going on a vision quest in 1989, and that vision quest sort of launched me into following this path. And I went on that quest because I was going through a very difficult time in my life. I was in a lot of emotional pain. And my therapist had actually recommended that I go on the quest. And as a person who loves nature already, the idea of being on a quest in nature, in the wilderness ended up being 10 days, actually was very appealing to me, and it really changed me a lot. And when I came back from that quest and shared with her my story, she said, "You really need to study shamanism." And unbeknownst to me, she shared an office in her psychotherapy practice with a person who was a instructor for the Foundation for Shamanic Studies. And he regularly taught classes in Madison at the time. And so the next class that he offered, I took, and I felt like it really, I've been sort of exploring spiritually for a while. And once I learned some of those practices, it just really felt like home. And so that started me down this path. And after that first class, I just tried studying with anyone and everyone that I could, different shamanic practices. So I've studied different cultures, Peruvian, Tibetan, a number of different, Celtic, I can't even remember all the different kinds, sort of wanting to have almost like an anthropologist's understanding of it. I'm gonna adjust my camera here because I'm a little bit too high up there. That's better. So that kind of gave me a broader spectrum of understanding certain tendencies and styles of different shamanic practices around the world. And so, a number of years after I first started studying it, I finally started doing work with people and doing healing work with people and taking it, sort of out into the public instead of it being sort of like a quiet, private spiritual practice. So now it's been, 89. I guess we're going on 32 years.
Wow.
That I've been doing this work. So long time. So anyway, so before we start, I had mentioned this to you earlier. I want to just set the atmosphere of our interview here by just taking a few moments and inviting in the spirits to hold us and be with us and guide us in our interview today and our sharing today. So for you and whoever else will be listening to this in the future, I invite everyone to just close your eyes, put both feet on the ground, take a deep breath, and just be in your heart. right, my dear.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I definitely feel so much better now.
Good.
Well, it
That's the
is.
idea.
Yes, I've missed that. It just brings me back to all those times that I had sessions with you, so it helps. So I have chosen to talk about ancestral trauma today because a lot of the times we're not really even aware of our own trauma, let alone that we carry trauma from others. And this is a newer subject to me. And the more and more I'm coming out about healing and about, processing through trauma and alchemizing it, I have a lot of people reaching out and they're really interested in learning more. So I think it would be an important discussion to know that we also don't just have our own trauma, we have ancestral trauma. And so I was wondering if you could begin by telling us, what is ancestral trauma?
It's a huge topic. I took some notes just to keep clear. So ancestral trauma is trauma that gets passed down through the generations, and that trauma shows up in a lot of different ways. So, for example, common ancestral trauma would be things like patterns of addiction, alcoholism, drug abuse, sexual abuse, incest. These things often get passed down generationally. Excuse me, as I'm looking at notes, there's so much to talk about. Domestic violence, poverty, hate crimes, behavior patterns, weird behavior patterns that are behavior patterns that came from adjustment to trauma. Those behavior patterns become so much a part of a person. And if you're raising children carrying those behavior patterns, those get passed down. And so there's generational trauma, which are things that have happened in a family that get repeated and repeated and passed down. There's also cultural trauma. So cultural trauma, we think of like if you're Jewish and you have ancestors who lived through the Holocaust, for example. I mean, that would be something that you did not personally experience the Holocaust, but because you have ancestors who did, you carry that trauma because it's talked about and it's got such a huge energy field around it that it impacts behavior in a family system if you're Jewish. And that would be also true if you're in a culture where that was constantly in war, like Palestinians and Israelis, or other tribes that have been at war for a long time. So war becomes a cultural trauma that then impacts people individually. And that trauma you begin to carry even if you're not living anymore in that war zone or in that place where that trauma is going on. And so what do we know about trauma? Trauma elicits certain types of behaviors in us. So, classic behavior things that are part of trauma is if we carry trauma, and often we also think of PTSD, post-traumatic traumatic distress. So hypervigilance, high anxiety, depression, panic attacks, nightmares, insomnia, being very sensitive in flight or fight, sort of traits. These are classic traits that are associated with trauma. And so, if you had a parent that was traumatized and was constantly anxious and constantly worried, and you're a child growing up under the aura of that energy, you start automatically becoming conscious, constantly anxious or worried, even though you may not really be in any danger, or there may not be anything going on that's really that that you're at risk that much. But being around somebody who is acting out old trauma can start activating that hypervigilance and that anxiety in you. So, trauma, ancestral trauma is a huge, huge thing. I mean, we all have some types of ancestral trauma, but what we're talking about here are the really big ones, the ones that really make us dysfunctional in certain ways because we're acting out in ways that are like not healthy. Or, you know, and we know from a psychological perspective, if you're a girl that grew up in an environment where your father was beating your mother, for example, and there is violence at home, you start normalizing that, and you're more likely to choose a partner who is violent against you than not. You know, this is how part of how generational trauma or ancestral trauma is affecting you. And, you know, when I work with clients, I often find that, you know, and just using the example of being in violent relationships, you will see that going back to the mother and the grandmother. And there'll be stories about, oh, my great grandfather was a real ass, you know, and so, you know, so even though you don't know 3 generations back very well, if somebody was a really nasty person in your family line, there's usually some old gossip that's getting passed down about that ancestor. And so, you know, so these things really affect us, and they set us up to normalizing unhealthy behavior and sadly even gravitating to replicate it ourselves. And so, you know, ancestral trauma is huge. It's huge. As I said, all of us have some of it because all ancestors have gone through something. I mean, there is no such thing as a completely serene, easy life for anybody, but certain type of traumas that had a really huge energy impact are more, and if that energy impact, that trauma doesn't get healed in that lifetime, those behavior patterns start getting passed down and passed down and passed down.
Well, that's why it's so important to alchemize and heal it when you can, and when you pick it
Right,
up that you have it, so it
right,
doesn't get passed down. So
right.
talking about passing on, how does it get passed on? I know you talked about behaviors and why it might, but like on an energetic level, how does that happen?
I mean, so we're going to talk about things from a shamanic perspective because I'm a shamanic practitioner. Um, so from a shamanic perspective, we work with a number of different things. So when you're a shamanic practitioner, what you do is you work with spirits that you've developed, helping spirits you've developed a relationship with. And those helping spirits are non-corporal. They don't have bodies. They can travel through time and space backwards and forwards, back in time or forward in time.
Wow.
And so when you're working with these with spirits and you're working with a client, you ask those helping spirits as a practitioner, you know, where did this begin? So you're seeing a pattern in a client and you're talking to your client, you're interviewing your client, as I do, and, you know, and they're struggling with a particular behavior pattern or something that's going on with their lives. And I'll often ask, you know, did your mother or father or any of your grandparents do this also? And oftentimes they'll say, oh yeah, like my grandmother did this, or my grandmother was always really, really, really depressed and my mother was depressed. And so from a shamanic perspective, you're looking at what energetically is going on. And depression can be a result, it can be a result of old trauma. Oftentimes from shamanic perspective, with a shamanic perspective, we look at things like soul loss. So soul loss is disassociation from trauma. And oftentimes where there's trauma, you have generations of people checking out, not wanting to be in their bodies because the trauma is too painful for them, and being in your body makes you feel it more, so you just disassociate. And so a lot of times from a shamanic perspective, I'm looking like, is there soul loss? Is there ancestral soul loss? Is there a pattern of disassociating to cope with uncomfortable feelings? And when I'm looking at it ancestrally, I may ask the spirits, when did this begin? How many generations does this go back? Was there an event that happened to some ancestors 2, 3, 4, sometimes 10 or more generations back that set in motion this particular pattern of behavior. And oftentimes, from a shamanic perspective, what you're doing is with your helping spirits, you journey back in time and you're shown what originally happened, and you rework the energy around that. You sort of extract the traumatic event, clear it from the energy field, and that actually can help downstream drain off that sort of trapped traumatic energy. But there's so many different angles of this. So sometimes there's soul loss, as I was talking about. So disassociation that happens because a person's not feeling safe in their body. They're constantly anxious. They're constantly checking out. But there's other kinds of things like soul theft, for example. So one pattern that I see happening a lot from a shamanic perspective is generations of parents stealing life force from their children. So if you have a very depressed parent, or on the other hand, an extremely controlling parent, they may take some essence from their child either to fortify themselves because they don't feel strong enough and they want some of that child's life force and energy to kind of help themselves be stronger, or sometimes they'll take part of that energy because they want to control that child. So you'll see patterns of extreme control going on. And when I check shamanically what's going on, what I see is that an ancestor, it might be a parent or it might be a grandparent, is literally holding on to a piece of that client because of their control needs, or because of their survival needs, or because of their fears. And that client cannot fully step out and be independent on their own because that ancestor is hanging on to them or hanging on to a part of them. And sometimes when that ancestor dies, they don't leave. They still are hanging around like a balloon around that person. So you have to help that ancestor move on. In a lot of shamanic cultures, the belief is that a lot of the troubles that happen in the village are from ancestors who have not moved on after their death, and that they're continuing to haunt their families. And now, because we live in a much more we have these sort of nuclear families, we're not as connected to extended family like people in tribes used to be. I find that it's not always ancestors that are sort of hanging on, but in shamanic cultures, the belief is if there were ghosts hanging around, they were often ancestor spirits that didn't want to leave. A grandmother that adores a particular grandchild, and when she dies, she just doesn't want to leave that child, and so she continues hovering around. And that may sound like very dear and stuff, but that soul really needs to move on into the light if they really want to be helpful. If grandma's hanging around, that ends up being a burden to that child, and they may not even realize it. What's going on is that they're feeling and experiencing this leftover baggage from grandma, and a lot of times we think of attached spirits as something negative or bad, but in shamanic cultures, a lot of times they were just seen as ancestors that had not properly moved on, or had not been grieved properly, had not been allowed to move on onto the light. So you have soul theft, you have possession, you have sometimes there's even curses that get passed down in family lines. So when you see, I've seen some really curious curses that follow a family line for generations. Things like oldest son dies early, or constant chronic problems with marriages that fall apart, or chronic problems with financial disaster. I remember working with a client that was a very good business person, and they would build a business up and build a business up, and it would start growing and growing and growing. And once it got to this certain point where it's about to really launch, my camera just went out.
That's okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, camera. Oh goodness. Should I talk, or do you want us to restart here?
You can go ahead. Maybe it'll pick back up.
Okay. Okay. So I'll go on with my story. So hold on. Okay. I
Yay.
think I got it. I think I got it. All right. Goodness. So anyway, every time this client got to this certain pinnacle in their business, some disaster would happen and their business would completely collapse. I mean, it would either be a lawsuit or it would be something weird that would come out of the blue, and it was like they could never get past a certain threshold of success. Well, this had happened to a great uncle, and it had happened, and there was stories through the family line of this of people in this family being very successful in the business, but couldn't get past a certain point before the business would collapse and something awful would happen and the whole business would fail. And this was a curse. This is a curse that went back, again, I'm adjusting my camera here, hope I don't. This is a curse that went back many, many generations, that was directed at a family member of never being able to be successful financially. And so part of shamanic work would be undoing an old curse so that that energy is not activating over and over and over. And so generationally, when we think of ancestral healing, these things, it's not like if there's a trauma in the family, every single person has that trauma. It's not, it, everyone may feel it, but not every person gets as activated by it as others. So you'll see, in a family of, if you have a family of like 4 kids, and there's a trauma that's getting passed down generationally, it may affect the girls more than the boys, or it might only affect the oldest, or it might only affect the youngest, or and I think part of this too is, so we're talking about what's getting passed down generationally, but part of this too, now let's look at our soul journey. So we have 2 lineages in our current body. We are having 2 lineages. We have the lineage, which I call the soul lineage, which is our soul is infinite, and I believe we reincarnate over and over and have many, many lifetimes and many, many experiences. And so our soul has all these life experiences, and then we're born into this body. And what merges is the ancestral lineage, the blood lineage of the body that we are born to. So this is the lineage of traumas that are specific to the biological mother and father that we come from. And so sometimes it's a really toxic cocktail, because you might have had a lot of traumas in a past life, and then you're born into a family with a whole different set of traumas, and it's like, pretty intense. And so, but it's, again, going back to why trauma affects some individuals in a family more than others. If your soul is older or has had more experience with something, and you're born into a family where that trauma is activated, you may be better equipped to handle it than your siblings. So let's say you've had a number of lifetimes where you struggled with alcoholism, and in those past lives you finally mastered not being addicted to alcohol, and then you're born in a family where there's alcoholism, and your siblings become alcoholics, but you don't go down that path. You're still affected by it. It's still traumatizing, because here you are back in the stew of alcoholism, but your soul has mastered skills to avoid succumbing to it. So how people respond in a family system is, just because there's trauma in a family system doesn't mean it's going to hit you as hard, or it might hit you really hard. But that depends on your soul lineage. That depends on what level of maturity and experience you have with that sort of behavior and trauma, how you navigate through it. And so that's important to recognize, that trauma does not affect every person the exact same way. We are all individuals. Our soul lineage is unique because we've had a multitude of other lifetimes before the current lifetime that we're in. And so how we cope with the trauma that's in the family we're born into is going to be different depending on what skill set we came to the table with, so to speak.
Wow, that is quite interesting, like to have all those different combinations. And I mean, to be honest, that kind of answered my next question and in a great detail. One thing that I'm curious of is, you talked about having different lifetimes, which I believe in reincarnation as well. So you were saying that it is possible to have different ancestral trauma at the same time, correct?
Yes.
Oh my
Yes.
goodness, that's so messy. That's
Yes, it is. It is. But when you're from a shamanic perspective, and again, I'm always consulting with my helping spirits. You know, when I see something that's really messy going on with a person, I'll ask a couple of leading questions to help me know which path am I going down? Is this like ancestral? Is this past life? And so a lot of times I'll ask, are there other members in your family that this has happened to? And if the person's saying, yeah, it happened to my mother, and it's like my grandmother, and and I heard my great grandmother was like this, then I know we're on an ancestral path. But if the person saying is like, no, everyone else in my family seems to be just fine, I'm the only one who's all messed up with this, then that usually, if there's no influence ancestrally affecting somebody's trauma, and there's nothing that they've experienced in their current life that really fits in with the trauma that they're experiencing, reaction they're experiencing, then I usually start going down the path of, okay, maybe this is a past life thing. And what happens with past life trauma is that when we die and our soul returns to heaven, we get purified and cleansed so that it basically gives us a clean slate to, we don't want to be born remembering all the trauma of previous lives that we've had. Our soul knows it, but it's part of, it's a design to have that slate kind of cleared enough so that we carry the lessons we learned from those past lives, but we're not remembering the traumas. But what happens in the current life is, if something happens that in some way replicates a really bad trauma from a past life, it's almost like memory bleed through comes through, and all of a sudden you start reacting in a really big way, and perhaps even like disproportionately to what your experience is, because it's mimicking a past life trauma that was really, really, really huge. And so you may suddenly find that you go into like PTSD, or you're having panic attacks. And, when you try and explain what set off the panic attack, anyone listening to you is like, that doesn't seem so bad. That doesn't make sense. And if you're asking, like, did something like this happen in your family? Well, no. That's when I start following down the track of, okay, there's a past life. This is being driven by something in a past life. So from a shamanic perspective, you want to look both lineages. And by asking the right kinds of questions, you can narrow down a little bit which direction you're going, because it is this huge world that's really messy. I mean, once you start going into past lives and ancestral stuff, it's like, holy cow, how am I going to find my way through this? And this is why we work with helping spirits, because the helping spirits have seen all and been in all places at all time. They have the information. So you go to them and say, is this a past life? Yes or no? And they'll say yes. And I'll say, okay, show me what happened. Take me back to the time. What happened that is activating this in this person? And then you work with healing that original trauma, which sort of decouples the person's association with that trauma and helps bring some calming down to their system. So you're either going down an ancestral lineage, this is something that happened in ancestors, you go back through a soul lineage, this is something that happened to this person in a past life. And sometimes it's a combination of both, or sometimes people loop back. So you've had a past life where something really crappy happened in this family. You choose not to reincarnate in that family for quite a long time. And then further down the line, you realize, wow, in order to heal this that happened to me this time, I got to be reborn in this damn family and fix this mess by experiencing how this came downstream. So you'll see people coming back to family lines that they were in perhaps centuries before, but hadn't been in for a long, long time, because they're trying to heal something that the best way to heal it is to reinsert yourself into that family stream of energy. Does that make
Kind of
sense?
like, yeah, kind of like being thrown in the water, like in order to learn how to swim, you like your parents would throw you in the water and you kind of have to find your way type of thing.
Well, my parents didn't throw me in the water. They gave me swimming lessons when I was like 4 years old.
I didn't either, just an old saying.
Well, and can you imagine, here's a great example. Can you imagine if you had drowned in a previous life and you had parents that thought that that's the way to teach you how to swim is to throw you in the water? Can you imagine how traumatizing that
Oh
would
my
be?
God, that would be the worst case.
But I mean, things like this happen all the time. Something that's like, well, I threw your brother and sister in the water and they were just fine, but I threw you in the water and you like, had practically drowned and had a panic attack. I mean, this is how we reactivate old traumas too. And actually even something like drowning. If you've had an ancestor that nearly drowned and is now absolutely phobic of water, there you can see that parent hovering over their child, not letting them go out and swim, not letting them do anything around water. And pretty soon that child grows up thinking that water is something really, really scary. And they won't even take swimming lessons or even go in shallow water because the parent from their drowning experience or their ancestors' drowning experience has instilled this intense fear about being in water. So something as simple as a near drowning experience that can get passed down ancestrally too.
So it's just not necessarily even something that could be big. It could be something small, but it happened where it was traumatizing enough that it just energetically got passed down.
Exactly. And emotions are energy. So if you have this intense fear of something and you keep on unloading that fear on your child over and over and over, you are literally bathing them in your fear energetically. And so that child takes that on. They don't realize that, mommy almost drowned and so she's extra scared and extra careful. That child just takes on, and children tend to be very empathic. So if the mother just goes into like tragic heart palpitations around water and that child is near her, they're going to start feeling that and they're going to make this association of water as something really, really scary. I mean, I'm just using drowning as an example, but there's many ways, in dramatic ways and subtle ways, that that trauma can get passed down. And trauma is, and let's be clear that what trauma is how the person is personally experiencing it. I mean, we can think of, being beaten up is an obvious reason for trauma, but being scared of water when you've never had any drowning experience yourself, you wouldn't think that's trauma. But if it over, when we think about a lot of science right now about dysregulation, how our brain gets dysregulated when we are in a traumatic state, something, whatever dysregulates your system to a point that you have difficulty functioning is trauma, whether it's big or small. If it's overwhelming to you and you find that you cannot cope with normal things as a result of that activation, that qualifies as being traumatized by something. And there's you know and the worst kinds of traumas are ones that are repeated over and over and over again, so it gets really logged into your energy field and your energy system. So for example, situations of incest where you are repeatedly being sexually abused, one event is traumatic enough, but if it starts happening over and over and over again, that becomes really complex, really intense trauma. And I have yet to work, for example, using the example of incest, I've yet to work with a client who does not have a lineage of incest in their family if they are an incest survivor. Not one client that I've worked with doesn't have a grandfather, a great grandfather, an uncle, or somebody that was happening to, or their grandmother or somebody. I mean, this is something that definitely gets passed on ancestrally. So these kind of behaviors, part of ancestral healing is it stops here. I'm the last one. I'm not passing this on at all. I think a lot of women choose not to have children because they're afraid of passing on the trauma that they carry. They don't want it to go beyond them. And so they don't want to have children at all. But then there's those of us who really want to heal, and we want to change this trajectory of repeated patterns that are getting passed down. And we start realizing, oh my goodness, this happened to my mother. This happened to my sister. My sister married somebody who's now abusing their child. I do not want to be a person that continues passing this on. And so the healing is extremely important, because if we stop that flow of that energy, when you think that each one of us, if we are to have a child and that child has children, we pretty quickly, I can't remember, I was looking at the numbers of a couple having 2 children and those 2 children having 2 children, and on and on and on. I mean, it doesn't take too many generations before we're talking about dozens, if not hundreds, of people influenced by trauma. And so just putting a finger in the dike and stopping the flow where we are stops trauma for hundreds of our descendants.
Does that count the ones that have passed on? Does it have some sort of ripple effect to the ancestors?
It does have a ripple effect. So, since from a shamanic perspective, since you often work with these ancestral traumas by going back in time, you take the energy stream out of the family line. I often find that if I'm working for a client and I've done ancestral work or past life work, any work that's going back upstream and healing that upstream, that, I don't have permission to heal other family members. I'm only working on behalf of my client. But because it's all part of a system, the family is a system, and what's happened ancestrally is a system that's going back in time. Just tweaking that system back in time, a lot of my clients report that behavior changes start subtly happening in the family. It's not like it's going to miraculously heal everybody, but it does seem to change the intensity level in the family system. If one person's done that work for the family, it starts changing things energetically for the whole family. If more members of the family participate in that healing and do healing, the ripple effect, so to speak, is even greater. But it definitely does affect the family system when you're working even with just one person.
That's what I was curious about, and it's really interesting to know that, because before I did plant medicine, I always looked at ancestral trauma as a way of healing yourself and then healing just through the ancestors, but I never looked at it as healing, for future lineages. I never saw it like that.
Well, it goes both ways. And actually, when you think a family system is like it's a whole energy field in and of itself. Every person who's related holds a thread that keeps everyone connected energetically, whether you like that person or not, whether you've talked to them and haven't talked to them in decades, or they're dead. It's still sort of a collective field. So, you think of that collective field of your family system like a spider web. If you just touch one little corner of a spider web, the whole web wiggles.
Right.
So, when you're doing this work on an energetic level, if you're healing one little piece, it does shift the whole web, because that whole family system is part of a web going back in time and going forward in time. And so, what you want to do is you want the web to start restructuring so it is more and more healthy and can hold a better potential for the descendants to have healthier choices, to move forward in healthy ways, and to pass on healthy behaviors.
Thank you so much. That is so helpful. Like, this is so in depth. I feel like, even though somebody may not know what this is, I feel like it can put a flag and say, hey, I noticed this and I noticed that. I can then start bringing off these little alarms in a person and say, like, make them aware, make them want to heal type of
Yeah.
thing. Kind of, bringing about awareness.
Well, healing is never easy and it's never comfortable. A
Right.
lot of times in order to do that healing, we have to look at things that are painful or bring up a lot of grief. Grief, not only of things that happened, but sometimes the grief is the things we realize we wish we had had in our family of origin that we never got. And so oftentimes it's the bravest souls that are the ones that pursue doing personal healing. There's so many people that want to stay in denial of how bad things were in their family system. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to go there. They don't want to think about it. And actually what they do is they trap themselves and they block themselves from healing. And so oftentimes the black sheep of the family are often the ones that end up pursuing the healing because in the sense sometimes they feel like they have nothing to lose. They already feel like the family has sort of shoved them to the side, and so they may as well, since they're on their own, they may as well like forge forward and try and make themselves whole in some way or form. And so it's doing any type of healing work, and particularly doing ancestral healing work, is not for the faint of heart.
Right. I
You
can
have you got
testify to that.
you got to be willing to face the ugly stuff. But also I think what I haven't talked about yet here that is important to remember is that there are also gifts that we get from our ancestors. There are a lot of, our ancestors have gone through, some of them really horrendous things, and they lived to procreate and create descendants. And they lived because they developed strategies and learned things in order to be strong and to be resilient in those difficult times. So we get unhealthy behavior patterns from our ancestors, but we also sometimes get very strong, resilient patterns. Those are the gifts that come from the ancestors. And so it's important to remember, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, God, I had lousy ancestors. Like, I don't ever want to think about them or talk about them or anything ever again. We need to remember that those ancestors also gave us really, really special gifts. For example, a huge irony, my father's an extremely difficult man. He passed about 11 years ago, and he was a scientist. I was never able to talk about the work that I do with him. He would have absolutely verbally run me through the coals if I was doing this. Scientists didn't believe in that sort of stuff. And yet the greatest irony was my father was unbelievably psychic, like scary psychic. He would have
Wow.
been in complete denial of it. But, and it didn't register to me until I started recognizing that I was psychic and that I had these gifts. And I remember things happening, like I'd be thinking of doing something and I was debating whether I should do one thing or another thing. And my father would call out of the blue and he says, you got to be careful about these kinds of things. You should not do blah, 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 blah. And it would happen to be the very damn thing I was thinking about. And I may not have talked to him for like 2 months because I didn't talk to him too often because he was difficult to be around. And sure as hell, he would call me up with these things out of the blue that happened to be like in the atmosphere of what I was thinking about or doing at the time. And I would just listen to the call and be like, oh my, how did you know that, Mr. Scientist? And I think actually my father was probably at one point a very spiritual person who got really shut down. And in the sciences, if you're a scientist, you really get crucified. I choice of the words, probably not the best choice of words, but you basically get crucified if you get too woo-woo in your philosophies or the things you're studying. And so there's a huge pressure on scientists to completely abandon spiritual beliefs of any sort or to follow them. And if you do that, you keep that really close to you, because you don't want any of your colleagues to know that you believe in any of that stuff. So, I realized, my difficult father, who would have trashed me if I'd shared with him the work that I do, was himself particularly gifted, and like scary gifted. And he would have if I had said that to him, he would have taken to his grave in denial that that was possibly true. But it showed up so many times with weird accuracy. I remember one Christmas, going home to Christmas with the boyfriend I was dating at the time, and my father always loved giving books. He was an intellectual, so he always gave books at Christmas time. And he gave my boyfriend a book that was titled The Shaman Caves of the South of France. Wow. And my boyfriend takes the paper off of the wrapping off of the book, looks at it, looks at me, and he goes, and I'm like, I mean, it was that kind of like crazy stuff. I'm like, Dad?
You can't explain that. Like, you
can't explain that. But again, all of this is going back to our ancestors have gifts for us also. So it's important that we may be focusing on the painful, ugly things that we recognize because they're affecting us the most. But sometimes in our hurt or our anger or our denial or whatever, we push aside seeing there's certain gifts of resiliency, certain innate gifts that our ancestors have that have also been passed down to us, even gifts that they're in total denial of, like my father, that this has become part of my life. If I got that gift from him. He's the Basque in me, and the Basques were they were some of the last people to accept Christianity in Europe, when it was taken over by the church. So, a lineage of indigenous spiritual people, that's in my bloodline. And it comes through my father, even though he was a scientist who was in total denial of anything spiritual. It's a gift that I carry. So,
of course.
So it's remembering that it's important to, there's a lot of important healing that can be done ancestrally. But also in that work, we also have to integrate the gifts that come from the ancestors as well, because it's both.
And our ancestors were, just like us. They lived lives and they've gone through trauma. So of course, it's not all bad, but unfortunately trauma does get, passed on, and
right.
It doesn't mean to happen, but it does.
Yeah.
So what are different modalities people can heal their ancestral and lineage and trauma?
There's a number of different approaches. One of the things that's a popular therapy is called constellation work, family constellation work, that certain therapists practice. And that really works with, in a sense, acting out role play therapy, in which you put yourself in the place of different ancestors and kind of merge with that and express it. And it's a way of seeing through their eyes. And sometimes seeing through our ancestors' eyes helps flip our perspective on something in a way that helps us heal, or helps us move more into a place of forgiveness or acceptance. So there's family constellation work is really, really helpful. There's a lot of ancestral healing work that's being taught by Daniel Foor, Foor. I just wrote down, he has a website, ancestralmedicine.org. And so he's teaching sort of it's kind of a hybrid of a shamanic energy and therapy form of ancestral healing work. most shamanic practitioners who've had any depth of training also do ancestral healing work. So, and a lot of therapists, if you're interested in ancestral healing, there are therapists that have specialized doing a lot of trainings on ancestral healing. So there's a number of different angles, whether you want to go through traditional therapy, whether you want to do a more energy healing type of approach, whether you want to use, just attending some of these ancestral healing workshops, for example, you're going to get a lot. Just to learn the practices, you're going to do a lot of personal healing in those trainings too, whether you're going to be a therapist or not. I find that those trainings are hugely helpful for personal growth. So there's a lot of different ways to approach this work. And, and if you need ancestral healing, I think the most important thing to start asking yourself is, what patterns am I carrying or am I struggling with that I'm also seeing in other family members? Siblings, aunts, uncles, parents, grandparents, great grandparents. If you're seeing a pattern repeating itself, that's an unhealthy pattern that seems to be getting in the way of living in a whole and happy way, that's probably something ancestral that's going on that may need to be explored. And that part of the healing that you need to do is not just how it's personally affected you, but looking at unhooking from the ancestral pattern, tracking the ancestral pattern and working with it ancestrally.
Very good. Like, I like how you brought up like being self-aware, because I think that was one of the questions on here is, if somebody is interested in healing that, but they're not really sure what to look for. I thought that was a really good tip that you brought up, is like just starting to be self-aware.
There's always patterns. There are always patterns. A good healer tracks repeating patterns, because where there's a repeating pattern, there's something that's driving it. And, identifying what that pattern is will lead you to, as I said, whether it's past life, whether it's ancestral, whether it's just this life and your stuff. Self-awareness is the first step in all healing, really, in many ways. We don't seek help if we aren't paying attention enough to ourselves to know that we need help.
Amen to that. That is for sure. I took notes myself and I'm just seeing it. I don't want to miss anything. Okay. Yeah, I had a lot of questions that came up, but you covered so much with it. Okay, so after healing work is done, I know like when you worked with me, not necessarily with ancestral stuff, you would always have me go into some kind of like, you would just tell me to rest and like take things easy. So what are your recommendations for doing after doing ancestral healing?
Well, we would call this integration time. So whenever you're doing healing work, somebody like me, my sessions run like 3 or 4 hours. I mean, that's a big chunk of time working on healing. And, I've kind of done psychic surgery in a sense. And so you want like if you're having a physical surgery, you would rest and be gentle with yourself for a while so your body could kind of integrate the surgery. And on an energetic level, it's not that different. I mean, you may not have an incision in your body from a surgery, but energetically, a lot of stuff has been, kind of reworked and moved around and stuff. And so, a lot of times after a big ancestral healing session or any type of healing session, I find people go in one of two directions. You either feel super energized because a huge weight has been lifted from you, or you feel really tired and you want to nap a lot for a few days. Both are natural responses to healing. So part of it is paying attention to your body and what do you need, and basic good self-care things like drink lots of water, eat healthy foods. Oftentimes I find that taking Epsom salt baths, a couple of baths in the week after you've had a big healing, really helps, because that helps detox the system. And just then notice what changes. A lot of times what people find is they'll find that they're less reactive. So something that was a huge trigger for them before, when they come across a similar situation, all of a sudden they realize, wow, that's not bothering me as much as it used to, so you'll notice that your reaction to things is different, that you're generally calmer, that people treat you differently. I mean, I've had people say that they've had people like come up to them and talk to them when that would never happen before after healing. It's almost like your energy field it becomes more receptive or more glowing or something, that people respond to you differently. And so all of these are outward messages that show you that something has changed. And so just taking stock. I mean, I usually find that people need several days of just not pushing themselves too much after healing so they can integrate. And then again, it varies from person to person. You can feel like really rapid changes, or you feel like a gradual, just like you're coming out of a fog and like waking up from out of a fog. And then it's just looking around and like, wow, the world just really looks and feels different right now than it did before. Every person is different. So it really depends from person to person, but self-care afterwards is really important. And, you know, and I encourage people, if you're prone to journal, take notes of things that come to your awareness. A lot of times people have like aha moments, like, you know, you've just learned some information about some ancestral things. And then you suddenly remember, God, I remember my mother telling me something about my great grandfather. And that fits in with what the spirits showed Anna, or, you know, I find that a lot of people have these kind of, they connect the dots over the days that pass. Stuff comes to their awareness that suddenly, like, the pieces of the puzzle start falling together. And so it's kind of nice to journal that, just because I find that sometimes those pieces of the puzzle don't come together for weeks afterwards, and all of a sudden you have that aha moment then. But all of this is about it all making sense. And, you know, we need that energetic healing, but cognitively, our brain also wants to understand why. And so when those pieces of the puzzle come together, the why starts to be answered. And that in itself is a type of healing as well.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I have to agree on that because, you know, there are, like, when I went through my own healing sessions, I had some whys that came up, and then they did come up later, just not right away. And then it's almost like it's almost kind of like closure, like, you know how people feel like they need closure to move on. That's kind of what it felt like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, because that understanding does allow a certain type of closure that the not understanding left us kind of like floating and uncertain and ill at ease. So yeah, I agree. It is a type of closure.
Yes. Anna, is there anything else that you would like the audience to know about ancestral trauma or healing ancestral trauma?
It's a huge topic. I mean, you know, when I teach classes and stuff, you know, I go a lot more in depth into each of those little pieces. So I think I squished as much in as I could for this sort of hour that we're spending here. So I think, you know, if you start tracking and noticing that there is indeed ancestral things that are affecting you, you know, seek out various different ways of getting support and healing with that. As I said, there's traditional therapists that have been trained in this that are really good. There are workshops you can take that you would probably receive a tremendous amount of healing in that workshop. There's, you know, shamanic practices, family constellation work. There's a lot of things out there. And actually right now, there's a tremendous amount of discussion in, you know, more advanced cutting edge psychology of understanding how much generational trauma affects people. And so that awareness is really upping the level of avenues to seek and to pursue for healing than there were even just 10 years ago. It's kind of a hot topic right now, to be honest, but it should be, because it's really important.
Absolutely.
And it affects all of us. So,
Yes.
you know, we're like finally getting it, that like ancestral shit really gets passed down and we better do something about it.
Yeah. And if people are interested in working with you, where can they find you? How can they contact you?
Best way to contact me, they can go to my website. So that would be www.thehollowbone.com. And I have, you know, I describe a lot of different types of healing things that I do. You can contact me through there. And so that offers a lot of information, and you know, a lot of people kind of want to read through that and sit and think about it before they work with me. So I find that if they just can sort of scroll through the pages and read and come back to it and come back to it and come back to it until they finally feel like they got the courage to see me. That's how it usually works. So, and I often find that, one session, this is not like therapy when you work with a shamanic practitioner. It's not like you have a session every week. I usually do one big, really intense session, as you know, you've worked with me. And usually that, most people want to work with that and integrate that for many, many months. I mean, I often don't get repeat clients for 6 months, a year, 2 years after initial session. So, the sessions are very in depth, but they do tend to cover a lot of territory.
Yes, I think you are just one of the best that are out there. I've just had phenomenal results and recoveries with you. And, for today and for all of your service, I thank you so much. Thank
My
you for
pleasure.
your love and your light and your support, Anna.
Thank you. And before we get off the phone or off the Zoom call, let's take a little moment and thank the spirits. So just close your eyes. Giving thanks to all the ancestors who were present here today, to all the helping spirits. Thank you for the information that was shared. May this touch the souls of all who watch this. May they be able to take this in a beautiful, soothing, and healing way. And we give thanks for all your support in this interview, in this time together, Brooke and myself. Thank you to helping spirits. Thank you for your love, your kindness, and your wisdom. We release you with our hearts full of joy. Aho.
Amen. Thank you, Anna.
Amen.
That was beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, dear. Well, good luck and keep me posted.
I will. Thank you, Anna. It was a joy interviewing you today, and I really appreciate your time.
Certainly.
All right.
Take care. All righty.
God bless you.
God bless you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.